It's really almost impossible to imagine what Joe Gans accomplished in his very short life.
Herman was so thoroughly knocked out by that one punch that his handlers thought that Gans had killed him. It took half an hour to revive him. You'll see that Joe Gans looks nervous too. For a black man to kill a white man in the Jim Crow era would put him in jeopardy of being lynched. Joe Gans fought Terry McGovern in December in Chicago. On orders from his manager, Joe Gans threw the fight. Gans won his greatest victory under the desert sun in Goldfield, Nevada in 1906. This fight lasted 42 brutal rounds. Gans knocked Battling Nelson down several times and battered his face into jelly. Before Muhammad Ali, before Joe Louis, even before Jack Johnson won the World Heavyweight Championship and turned back a string of great white hopes, an African-American boxer named Joe Gans had paved the way. Known as the Old Master, Joe Gans became in 1902 the first African-American world champion in boxing or any sport. In 1906, Gans would captivate the world by winning the fight shown here in what was then the mostly unpopulated state of Nevada.
Here you see Joe Gans, the original true boxer-puncher. In the 8th round, Joe Gans scored one of the many knockdowns he would score throughout the fight.
Joe Gans blazed the trail for the tremendous successes achieved by African American athletes in the 20th and 21st centuries. Gans was born in Baltimore, where he worked shucking oysters from an early age. He got his start in boxing by participating in the brutal and racist battle royals that were, during the Jim Crow era, an all too common form of entertainment at whites-only clubs. Up to a dozen young black boys or men were put in a ring, often blindfolded, and made to beat each other senseless until only one was left standing. Frederick Douglass described activities such as battle royals as among the most effective in the hands of the slaveholder in keeping down the spirit of insurrection. This brutal sport of the battle royal was later brought to public attention in Ralph Ellison's mid-century classic, Invisible Man.
Where did he come from? Because his background was a real mystery. Some sources said that Gans was adopted, and they always referred to his foster mother. So we looked through the records to find out who that woman was, and her name was Maria Gant, Maria J. Gant. We know now that that's Maria Jackson Gant. But records would indicate that she had as many as 8 children, some of whom were adopted or fostered. So we don't really know if Joe Gans was one of those. But his picture, his eyes, he was always referred to in the media as having sad eyes. But we looked at him, and Mark and I wondered, what is his nationality? Where did he come from? And I thought that he looked quite British, that his features were British. And many in my family thought that he looked like members of my boxing family. But he also has a look that maybe he came from the West Indies. So with research, we discovered that Maria Gant did in fact come from South America, that her family had immigrated to Baltimore in 1845 from British Guyana. And that colony, that British colony, had an interesting history. In 1807, it was outlawed. No country could import slaves from Africa after about 1807. And so that created a trafficking of slaves throughout the various countries internally. Baltimore became a big hub for transporting slaves. They had slave pens in that period of time between 1807 and the Civil War. And the slaves would be bought and sold and relocated to what they called the New Orleans market. So boats were always leaving Baltimore to go directly into the New Orleans market. In South America, in the British colony of Guyana, now known as Guyana, after they couldn't import slaves from Africa, they took slaves from the West Indies. And then in 1823, there was a tremendous uprising, a slave revolt in British Guyana that called attention to the problem of slavery. And the British Parliament then outlawed slavery. So they had done that in the late 1830s. And the transitional period between slavery and freedom was indenture. So they indentured their servants for 4 years. And it's at that time, in 1838, in those 4 years, that Joe Gans' mother, Maria Gant, then immigrated with her family to Baltimore. So Joe Gans really grew up with someone who probably spoke very proper British English, and he was always known to be articulate, quite modest, but he probably got that language pattern or air from his mother and her family's very proper British English. And also, he grew up as everyone did. He was born in 1874. So at that time period, he grew up as the first generation of free blacks in America. But he had already that experience of that freedom and that ability to take on and through determination, perceive opportunities and then go out and get them and be very successful. And so I attribute that largely to his mother and her background.
In the early 1890s, Gans began to develop a sense of timing, distance, and ring generalship that would eventually earn him recognition as the Old Master of Boxing. From 1894 to 1899, Gans fought over 60 bouts in Baltimore alone, along with his fights in other cities.
By the year 1900, he was widely considered the best boxer in the world, though he was yet to receive his first opportunity to win a world championship. Already a certain mysticism had developed around the man they referred to as the Baltimore Negro. Although he was only 26, in the boxing world they were already calling him the Old Master. But the year 1900 would nearly bring his career to a premature end.
Gans's first shot at the title would come in 1900. Gans and Frank Erne fought in February of 1900. Gans was winning the fight when in the 12th round a headbutt caused a large gash over his eye. The scar can be seen years later in this photo.
Gans was reviled in the newspapers for having supposedly quit. Actually, the cut was so bad that Gans' eye was out of the socket. After his loss to Frank Erne in 1900, Joe Gans went quietly back to work. During the year 1900, he defeated most of the contenders in the lighterweight divisions. In December of that year, he was involved in the controversial Chicago Fight Fix. Joe Gans fought Terry McGovern in December in Chicago. On orders from his manager, Joe Gans threw the fight. As you'll see in this video, Joe Gans was not a very good actor, and everybody knew the fight was fixed. In Chicago, there was such an uproar that boxing was banned in Illinois for 25 years, and it was nearly banned throughout the country because of that fight. Joe Gans took most of the blame. All boxing fans are familiar with the famous scene from the 15th round of the Joe Frazier-Ali fight, where Muhammad Ali gets knocked down in the 15th round. The story didn't end there, because Ali got up from that knockdown and finished the fight, actually, and won the last part of the round. And as everyone knows, he went on to become the heavyweight champion, regaining his title. Joe Gans, between the time he lost to Frank Erne in 1900 and the time he fought him again in 1902, fought 34 fights, very difficult fights as well. When Gans fought Frank Erne the second time in 1902, they had to move the fight to Fort Erie, Canada, and there was various reasons why they did that. In New York, there were concerns about fixed fights and so forth, and the year before, President McKinley had been shot, so there was there was concerns about having a boxing match in New York, and they decided to have the fight in Fort Erie, Canada. And before the fight, Gans had wanted to study Frank Erne, and of course he fought him before in 1900. And even though Gans was winning the fight before he got butted, he was having trouble with Frank Erne's. He had a strange move. He had a very good left jab, and he would move his head in a certain way. And so when Gans was training for the fight, he told his sparring partner to imitate or to throw his left jab like Frank Erne would do. And the sparring partner was instructed to throw the jab and move his head in a way like Frank Erne would do. And Gans he practiced and timed it, and so after a while he had it figured out just perfectly where Erne would throw his jab and move his head. And so when they fought in the very first round, when the first time Erne did that, he moved his head, and there was Gans's right hand just smack on his chin, knocked him out. He was knocked cold. When he woke up, Frank Erne was shocked. He didn't know what had happened to him. And Gans was the champion.